Live from the greatest genre library in northern Florida, it's the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Welcome to Paperback Warrior. If we paid Bruce Buffer to do that intro, I don't know if he would have done as good a job as what you did.
Let's get ready to podcast!
That's great. Yeah, you really should. You missed your calling.
I guess I'm to fall back on.
Yeah, exactly. Well, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and our flagship site, paperbackwarrior.com. We post 2 brand new reviews daily. Check those out at 6 a.m. and 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on our flagship site. Continue sending us emails. We love those. paperbackwarrior@yahoo.com. In fact, we've gotten a slew of fascinating emails from listeners and blog readers. And Tom, you had one specific exchange with a fan recently. Tell the listeners about that if you don't mind.
Man, I cannot say enough nice things about this guy. His name is Den Schumann. And he clicked on our donate button and sent up some money, which is really important because it costs us money out of our pockets to run this podcast. I mean, the web hosting costs stuff. By this point, we've sort of paid for the equipment. But he made a very generous donation to us, and that's great, and we appreciate that. And anyone can do that by going to the paperbackwarrior.com site in the upper right-hand corner of the desktop version. You can see a donate button. But this guy also reached out for me privately because he read a book he enjoyed that he wanted to pass on. So I gave him my address, figuring that if my library got burglarized, he'd be the main subject. And anyway, instead of waking up with this guy standing at the foot of my bed wearing night vision goggles, I actually received a book I had never heard of in the mail that looks really good. It's from this guy, Dan.
What do you have there?
Okay, here it is. Read the title.
With a Vengeance, a novel by Gerald DePego?
Yeah, I don't know anything about the guy. Never heard the guy. The novel itself is from... 1977, right? It's got a cover, kind of a cool-looking cover with a kid who looks like he's tied to a tree being set on fire.
That looks amazing.
Right up our alley. So anyway, the idea behind this book is that frat boys kill the main character's son in a hazing ritual where they handcuff him to a tree, hardy har har, we're a bunch of joke, and then they burn the guy alive.
Oh.
I know, which seems like a really bad plan for fraternity if you're trying to get pledges next fall. Anyway, the kid's dad, waits 20 years to seek his revenge on the sons of these frat boys. It sounds like an absolute bonkers standalone vendetta novel, and I can't wait to read it. So I really want to thank this guy, Den.
Yeah, that's great. That looks awesome. Yeah, let us know how it is.
Yeah.
Thanks, Den. We get offers fairly regularly from self-published authors wanting to send us copies of their new books to read and review. Most of the time, we politely turn down these offers. It's not that we think your book sucks. That's not the case. But it's that Paperback Warrior is a vintage fiction review site. So we very, very rarely ever cover contemporary works. We don't want to rip you off for a book we won't read or review. So just a polite decline from us is the way we handle these things.
Yeah, but here's the thing, though. This guy, superfan Den, has set a cool precedent here, right? So if you, the listener, read a vintage fiction book that you don't really care if it's in your library or not, and you think it falls in our wheelhouse, let us know via social media or our email address. But even better, if you want to send us your copy of the old book that you enjoyed, I'll be happy to take it off your hands. I can't promise with any certainty when or if I'll ever get to it, but you can contact me privately to get the mailing address. If it's a real good book, I'll read it and review it. If it sucks, I'll give it to Eric, and he'll probably read it and review it, because that's his whole thing.
I appreciate that. In fact, I've got a bumper sticker that says, "Bad fiction gives me a reason to rise and exist each day."
Clearly. So you're reading the book so we don't have to.
That's right. But anywho, what's on the show today?
All right, so today's topic is going to be men's adventure magazines. And we're going to talk about the efforts of 2 men to preserve the crazy stories in these magazines, in these compilation paperbacks they produce. Now, Eric, you're going to lead us off, and I'll chime in and drop some knowledge bombs along the way. But maybe it'd be helpful to define, what are we talking about when we discuss men's adventure magazines?
Yeah, so men's adventure magazines, which is often short to MAMS, M-A-M-S, they were prevalent in newsstands in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In fact, there were over 150 different magazines offering hundreds upon hundreds of monthly issues for an average cover price of about 30 cents. Here's some titles: Man's World, Man's Magazine, Male, Adventure, Man's Story, Peril, Real Adventure, Sir, Man's Illustrated, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, something to remember is that despite the masculine names, these are not porn magazines. Some had nudity, like Australian magazine Adam, for example, and most had scantily clad females, but most would be probably PG-13 by today's standards. The other thing to remember is that these were not pulp magazines. They weren't digests like Manhunt. These magazines were created for the common man after World War II. That was an audience of 16 million military veterans. The salacious art is by the same artists that were creating covers for the paperbacks we all love and adore. Some stories were fiction. Some were book extras that featured excerpts from a paperback novel. An example would be a scene in Dan Marlowe's hard-boiled caper, The Name of the Game is Death, that was used in a men's adventure magazine. It's a descriptive scene in the paperback, but it's brought to life with vivid artwork and an excerpt from the book. This helped sell the paperback, but also returned the favor by readers wanting to identify more with the book with the additional artwork found in the magazine. It's a win-win for both the publishers and the readers. These magazines contained lots of fake stories that were presented as real true stories, sometimes presented as written by John Doe, as told to him by Joe Smith. It's kind of the idea. One of those names is sometimes just a reworking of the author's real name. Lots of famous authors wrote for these. Lawrence Block, Mario Puzo, who often used the name Mario Clary. I had written down Bruce J. Friedman, Harlan Ellison, Robert Silverberg, and the list goes on and on. But the main problem as it stands in 2020 is that getting your hands on these magazines is very, very costly. But there's a solution.
Yes, and so what we have is there's these two guys, Bob Dice and Wyatt Doyle, and they have a website called menspulpmags.com, which celebrates and remembers these odd magazines, this weird kind of literary subculture. They also have a Facebook group called Men's Adventure Magazines and Books, discussing these magazines and the content and the art and all that. Bob and I had lunch together down in the Florida Keys back in 2018. He's a real cool guy. He educated me on the history of these magazines. He also explained that he and Wyatt have a publishing company called New Texture Books that creates these compilations of stories and art from the magazines into these beautiful trade paperbacks. The first one's from 2012, and it was called Weasels Ripped My Flesh. It's this 420-page compilation of awesome stories and pictures from the magazines, and they've released more other books also that were more themed instead of sort of a greatest hits. They had very specific themes.
Yeah, so like Tom said, the first one, Weasels Ripped My Flesh, two-fifths of stories from men's adventure magazines of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Bob and Wyatt collaborated with a gentleman named Josh Allen Friedman, and it's 400-plus pages of stories culled from the classic men's adventure magazines. Lots of military, exotic adventures, clashes with killer creatures. Heavy-hitting authors like Lawrence Block, Harlan Ellison, Mario Puzo are featured in this book. There's tons and tons of magazine covers and internal artwork, which is featured in really like full-color glory. It's really beautiful. I'm going to mention a few names that Bob and Wyatt have worked on and published, and sort of kind of like the theme of these. So the next one that they published was called A Handful of Hell, Classic War and Adventure Stories by Robert F. Dorr. This was edited by both Bob and Wyatt. At 300 pages, this is a collection of military fiction penned by Dorr, who was an Air Force veteran and a retired U.S. diplomat. He wrote over 60 books on aviation and military history. He was a prolific author of men's adventure magazine stories throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Tom, it's just an amazing collection, complete with all the colorful artwork you would expect. Another interesting one that they put out was called Cryptozoology, an anthology. It's edited by Bob and David Coleman, and Wyatt, of course. This is right at 300 pages and contains 13 short stories centered around strange creature stories from magazines like Saga, Showdown, True Weird, and Man's Illustrated, just to name a few. Remember, Tom, those killer animal movies from the 1970s?
Yeah, you're a huge fan of those. We talked about those a couple episodes ago.
That's the kind of stuff you're going to find with this collection of terrifying creature adventures. Of course, just like the other books, the artwork alone is worth a price of admission. This one's a really good one. Another one that they did is called Eva, Men's Adventure Supermodel. Remember that episode a couple weeks ago where we talked about the paperback model work by Jason Savas, and we touched on Steve Holland as well?
Yeah, you keep seeing the same faces on these paperbacks
Yes.
because a lot of the same models did work in that era and for the same genres.
Right. So Bob and Wyatt created a beautiful coffee table book about the female model, Eva Lind. The book features hundreds of photos of this Swedish beauty queen and her work as a leading model in the pinup, pulp fiction, and men's adventure magazines. Some are, I guess some of this is really my favorite portion of the book, is Eva's 1964 to 1974 era, where she worked solely with artist Norm Eastman. Obviously, the artwork in the book is just stunning. Eva is absolutely gorgeous. The book also features a lot of commentary and analysis from Eva herself about the photos and where she was in that place and time. It's a really cool book. Bob and Wyatt have collaborated on two books featuring artist Samson Pollen. Pollen was considered the grand master of illustration art in vintage men's adventure magazines from the 1950s through the mid-1970s. He did hundreds and hundreds of paintings for all types of periodicals and even paperback books. He was very proficient in creating beautiful females within his paintings. The first of the two Pollen books released by Men's Pulp Mags was Pollen's Women, The Art of Samson Pollen. It's a 130-page coffee table-sized book of landscape paintings culled from the vintage venture mags. Pollen was mostly known for his interior artwork. He did very little magazine covers. Of course, this is an art book, and it has hundreds and hundreds of images, complete with the name of the magazine and the publishing dates. There's also a detailed introduction by Bob and an interview that Wyatt conducted with Pollen. This is probably my favorite of the Men's Pulp Mags releases thus far. I really like this one a lot. The second Pollen book was Pollen's Action, The Art of Samson Pollen. Unlike the Pollen's Women, this one is catered to the explosive, over-the-top gunplay and the action sequences painted by Pollen for magazines like Stag, For Men Only, True Action, Men and Male. Like Pollen's Women, it's another 130-page coffee table book with large artwork, and it's really just visually stunning. Now, there are a few titles that Bob and Wyatt collaborated on that I didn't mention. Don't worry, we aren't leaving them out. In fact, Tom and I had a special presentation in mind for those.
Yeah. So you and I have been reading, because some of these books are pretty much straight art books. I mean, it was an introduction, putting the artist or the model in Eva's case in context. Others are kind of storybooks, so they've taken the actual stories from these men's adventure magazines and reprinted those with tons and tons of art in them. And so I think you need to know what you're looking for, right? The Samson Pollen ones are mostly just beautiful art books,
yes.
Whereas Weasels Ripped My Flesh,
Right.
It has like 400 pages of stories, from Lawrence Block and other people. So I thought it might be fun or helpful to our listeners, at least, to go back and forth reviewing the ones we've read, because you and I have been gobbling these things up for a while now, and they're just so much fun to read. And that way our listeners can get a feel for both the magazines and the compilations that Bob and Wyatt have put together. That sound good?
Sounds great.
So why don't you go first? I think you were going to do Barbarians on Bikes first.
Right.
Go for it.
What a name.
Yeah.
So my first capsule review is Barbarians on Bikes, Bikers and Motorcycle Gangs, and Men's Pulp Adventure Magazines. And when it comes to the post-apocalyptic stuff and men's action adventure, Paperback Warrior has featured a number of reviews featuring bikers and biker gangs, from sprawling doomsday sagas like The Last Ranger and Outrider to gritty vigilante novels like Hellrider. The inclusion of motorcycles and their riders is a consistent aspect of the freewheeling warrior spirit. We even have a tag. If you go to our website, the desktop version, on the right-hand side, you'll see a tag for bikers. So there's a lot of books written around biker mentality and biker adventure. But while most of our attention has been given to the 80s and 90s action paperbacks, in all actuality, the motorcycle fiction genre reached a fevered success much earlier. Between the 1950s to 1970s, men's action adventure pulp magazines featured wild, colorful, and over-the-top biker paintings and illustrations. The stories themselves ranged from harrowing military feats to sort of like Hell's Angels-styled escapism. This was all catered to the blue-collar male. It was an immensely popular and competitive market for the publishing industry. Now, Bob and Wyatt have collaborated and made this book and dedicated roughly 130 pages of just chronicling hundreds and hundreds of magazine covers. These are complete with gatefold spreads and a brief introduction that cites 1947's Cycle Rally Gone Wild, which was in Northern California, a little town called Hollister. And they cite that as sort of the real-life catalyst for America's fascination with the biker culture. And the book also features an analysis by our good friend Paul Bishop. He's a former LAPD detective, and he was a novelist for a number of great books, including the Faye Croker detective series. So he kind of weighs in on his experience with this genre. But again, this is an art book. It doesn't have stories. It's just an art book, and it's just filled with art. That's the only thing I can say. The pages are high quality, full blown scans of a lot of these hard to find magazines. It's sort of an all you can devour eye candy buffet, in my opinion. So it's really a lot of fun.
Good, and that one's called Barbarians on Bikes, right?
Yes, correct.
I have a copy of that. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to shift gears and talk about one which is kind of filled with stories, and it's called He-Men, Bagmen, and Nymphos. All the stories in the book were written by an author by the name of Walter Kaylin. I think it maybe is it Kaylin, I believe. Anyway, Kaylin lived from 1921 to 2017. He was like a top writer for these magazines. The book is called, like I said, He-Men, Bagmen, and Nymphos. It's this lovingly curated Kaylin's greatest hits collection of 15 of his stories from the Men's Adventure magazines, spanning from 1956 to 1978. There's also a few tribute pieces about Kaylin and his work included in there as well. He wrote for all the magazines back then, Stag for Men Only, and they told these salacious stories. Again, one of the things they often did in these magazines and in the compilation books is they present these stories as if they're true stories, as if it's like a story from National Geographic, but it's 100% from the mind of this guy Kaylin.
Right.
And so it's funny because they're presenting like, we're going to give you the story about this biker gang, and then he just creates the story, but he's presenting it as a piece of journalism, but it's pure fiction. So let me tell you about a couple of my favorite stories from this. First one was called Snow Job from a Redhead. It was from the 1956 issue of Men magazine. It's this first-person narration by a guy named Fred, who violently steals a small statue of a black bull from a fellow crook in an ambush double-cross. This one's not presented as a news story. It's just a straight-up fiction short story. Anyway, it's basically a heist crew or a criminal crew hiding in a small rooming house in Los Angeles, operated by this super sexy redhead. And the idea is, why does he want the statue? Why is this statue so valuable that it's worth killing? And can Fred withstand pressure from the local police who are trying to solve the murder? And will he get lucky with the redhead? All very important questions. And so it's just a super gripping short story. Kaylin writes a lot like Robert Randizzi, very dialogue heavy, without a lot of exposition. So you're kind of thrown into the action, and you're reading the dialogue between these people as things are happening, and you got to catch up with Kaylin. I really like that because there's not a lot of expository explaining. The anthology editors were really wise to start the compilation with Snow Job from a Redhead. I think it's the first story in it. And after finishing it, you're totally going to want to read more stories. There was another story called The Nymph Who Leads the African Death Army.
Oh, wow. I love that.
Yeah, it's great. And with a title like that, I totally needed to know more. And that's often the case, right? The headlines of these stories and the illustrations are so salacious that you need to know more. This one was from also Men magazine in October 1960. And this one was presented as a piece of journalism, like a feature you'd read in National Geographic or The New Yorker. But again, it's all nonsense coming from Kaylin's mind. Basically, it's a story about this guy named Max Broach and his group of international soldiers of fortune known as the Butcher Boys, who arrive in Cameroon and take over a peaceful village. They run up against this guy, this American expat living there by the name of Harry Tapp, who's this benevolent guy who teaches the natives how to play Three Blind Mice on trumpets. And that plot point becomes really relevant later in the story when the natives need to go to battle, and they're playing Three Blind Mice as kind of like their marching song. Anyway, it's just a lot of like super African stereotypical jungle dwellers and machete killings and stuff like that. It's just an absolute bloodbath and a really good story. The last story I read from that compilation by Kaylin was called Surf Pack Assassins. And this was also from Mail magazine. This one was from August 1967. And a lot of these stories were published under pseudonyms. This one was originally published under the pseudonym of Roland Empey. And basically it's the idea that there's this surf club and they go around the world on like this international hang ten tour. And Kaylin has a lot of fun trotting out the surf lingo. But the question is, they're rowdy all day, they surf all day, and drink themselves blind at night. But as the story continues, it becomes clear that there's something going on with this surf society because African democracy leaders are dying in cities corresponding with the surf crew's travels. And so the idea is this surf crew just a front for a group of actual assassins? And so, obviously it has salacious photos of people on surfboards killing each other and stuff. But there's a member of the U.S. intelligence agency who's investigating the surfers, and there's an undercover infiltration story in there. It was a lot of fun. It was every bit as good as the best Nick Carter Killmaster paperback I've read. And I thought the story may have gone on a little too long, but it was still really enjoyable. Anyway, so I just want to recommend this to you. This He-Men, Bagmen, and Nymphos. It was just an important collection of stories. The guys who put this together really should just pat themselves on the back. And I remember asking Bob Dice if Walter Kalin, before he was in an old folks home when the book came out, and Bob told me he was lucid enough to understand that this book was a tribute to his life's work. And then he died shortly after in 2017. Kalin wrote a single mystery novel for Fawcett Gold Medal called Another Time, Another Woman, published in 1963 that I want to check out sometime. The cover's absolutely horrible, but I bet the book is good because the guy could really write. And in other anthologies that they've put together, there's a smattering of other Kalin stories. So if you wanted to get one of those to sample his writing, but he's one of the best writers in the genre. So why don't you go ahead with one? I've been talking a while.
Well, my next one is I Watched Them Eat Me Alive, and this is another one of the books that Bob and Wyatt put together. And I grew up in the 80s watching all the killer creature horror movies that we alluded to earlier, stuff like Grizzly and Willard and Day of the Animals, Empire of the Ants. And when Jaws came out in 1975, it went more aquatic, so you had piranha, orca. And we even talked a little bit about it a few weeks back when you reviewed a novel called Croc, which was essentially about a killer crocodile in the subway system. So Bob and Wyatt put together a massive book chronicling 160 different pulp magazines between the 1940s and 1970s that feature the killer animal, killer creature sensation. In 120-plus pages, Bob and Wyatt present hundreds of magazine covers and panels, complete with issue dates, artist, and author credits. The two historians also present separate essays compiled as Funny as Hell, Killer Creatures and Men's Adventure Mags. These essays not only explain the origins of the literary phenomenon, but they also target the publishing audience. In thought-provoking analysis, Wyatt metaphorically links the violent animal attacks to blue-collar men's struggles with life's hassles, adjustments, responsibilities, and the uncertainty of life. By connecting the two, it's easy to envision the tired blue-collar working man finding enjoyment and similarities with each claw mark and animal bite. The book begins with stories by Stan Smith and Robert Silverberg and focus on the killer or monster crab sensation. I found both of these enjoyable, and I was fond of Silverberg's inclusion as I enjoyed his crime-noir novel Blood on the Mink, which was put out by Hardcase Crime. After the brief Flying Rodents Ripped My Flesh story by Lloyd Parker, which I might add is the only sugar glider horror story that I know of. There's this sensational Deadly Gorilla short story called Terror Safari by Lester Hutton, and it was presented from the 1961 January 1961 issue of Rage. The book finished with terror in two American locales, Strange Revenge of Wyoming's Most Hunted Giant Puma, of all things, by Robert Dorr, and Trapped in the Bayou's Pit of a Million Snakes by the guy you just mentioned, Walter Kalin. I think those are the two best stories in this compilation. From vivid, horrifying paintings and illustrations to genre analysis, I Watched Them Eat Me Alive was an eye-opening, and I'll have to say sometimes eye-squinting reading experience. It's some grisly images in here, but it's a lot of fun. Like the duo's other historic chronicles of pulp adventure magazines, I think this one's a mandatory inclusion for anyone who likes a vintage action adventure. Definitely pick that one up. It's really good.
Cool. And that one's called I Watched Them Eat Me Alive.
Yeah, say it again. It's fun.
I Watched Them Eat Me Alive.
Yes.
So the next one I want to talk about is Cuba, Sugar, Sex, and Slaughter. again, you need to keep in mind that a lot of these magazines were happening when the Cuban Missile Crisis was happening, before that, the Cuban Revolution itself. And so Cuba was on everybody's mind back then, much more so than it is today. And so they had a themed compilation that they put together called Cuba, Sugar, Sex, and Slaughter, which deals with stories. It's mostly stories. Obviously, there's art in there too. Pre-revolution, during the revolution, and from the early days of the Fidel Castro's regime. A lot of these, again, were presented as news stories that weren't true, obviously. A good one was called Brotherhood of the Scar, which was from 1959's Adventures for Men magazine by Jack Barrows. It falsely claims to be an eyewitness story of an ex-GI who was brutally tortured by Batista's savage Gestapo and lived to join the secret underground army that swore vengeance at any price. It's this 33-page torturous bloodbath that'll make anybody who read the Men's Adventure series paperbacks of the 1970s and 80s feel right at home. Another good one was Kiss the Skull of Death, My Beautiful Muchacha, which is allegedly by Linda Rogers as told to Jim McDonald. It's actually just a work of complete fiction by this guy McDonald. It originally appeared in the September 1965 issue of New Man magazine with graphic cheesecake art by the great Norman Sanders, again, lovingly reproduced in the anthology. There's a softcore sex opening that grabs the reader as the American female nightclub singer is ravished by her Cuban lover during Fidel's revolution. One thing leads to another, and our heroine is captured and turned over to El Toro for torture and interrogation. Very lurid stuff here. I just think it's amazing that these guys are able to keep these old stories alive. I mean, these magazines were not built to last, and even more so than the pulp magazines, but I don't think they were anywhere near as popular as the pulp magazines as far as the print runs and their impact on pop culture at the time. And so it's just, again, I can't say enough good things about it. I think you should, if you have any interest in kind of salacious stories about Cuba or just violent stories in general, you can't go wrong with Cuba, Sugar, Sex, and Slaughter.
Awesome. The last capsule review I'm going to do is a book called Mort Kunstler, the Godfather of Pulp Fiction Illustrators. Like the prior art books on Samson Pollen, Bob and Wyatt teamed up to spotlight Mort Kunstler's remarkable career. Kunstler was a premier painter that captured events in American history. His renderings of Civil War events is meticulously detailed. A lot of his work was done within mainstream publications, magazines like Newsweek, Good Housekeeping. He did National Geographic, for example. His contributions to men's adventure magazines in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s are really some of my favorite paintings by any artist. In the book's opening pages, there's 2 articles that inform readers on the life and works of Kunstler by directors of the Norman Rockwell Museum and the Heckscher Museum of Art. The book also includes a revealing interview with Kunstler conducted by Bob Dice. In the interview, he discusses his education, career, and works. The book features the artist's descriptive action-adventure paintings presented in beautiful full-color images throughout the 130 pages. The themes range from harrowing military renderings to naval and aviation battles to creature features like wild elephants, tigers, or even the mythical Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I was surprised to learn about the collaboration between Kunstler and esteemed author Mario Puzo, the writer of the critically acclaimed bestseller The Godfather. Their peak collaborating effort was when The Godfather was published by G.P. Putnam's Sons on March 10, 1969. An excerpt from the novel was featured in the August 1969 edition of Mail, and Kunstler was selected to paint the cover art and vignettes of principal episodes from the novel based solely on descriptions provided by Puzo. Kunstler also went on to do the cover of a July 1969 issue of Literary Guild Bulletin, which featured an abridged version of the Godfather book. Kunstler's remarkable career, his lifelike paintings, and his important contributions to the men's adventure magazines, movies, advertisers, and paperbacks is perfectly presented in this colorful and rather awe-inspiring coffee table book. I think this is a must-have for anyone remotely interested in the genre. These paintings are just beautiful. That wraps up the capsule reviews.
Yeah, so I'd say in all fairness that the books created by the guys at New Texture are the top of the heap. But there have been other compilations of stories and art from men's adventure magazines that have been released. A couple years ago, my father got me one called Soft Flesh and Orgies of Death. And it reprints a bunch of stories and art. It's really good, but my thing is it doesn't really provide any context at all as to the authors and the artists featured. The stories are awesome entertainment, but you don't really walk away with a better understanding of the genre and sort of its place in history the way you do with Bob's books. If you don't know where to start, because it's a bit overwhelming and we've thrown a lot of information at you, you can make peace with the idea of black and white reproductions of photos. Your best bet might be the first compilation, Weasels Ripped My Flesh. It's a great cross-section of stories and authors with lots of informative stuff about the genre. I think that's the way to go. The themed ones are great if they interest you, but if you really don't even know where to start, Weasels Ripped My Flesh is probably the best place to start. Anyway, so that's going to be it for the theme here on the Men's Adventure magazines. Eric, you have anything else you wanted to add about that?
I don't have anything else to add about that, but we do have a little bit of extra time, and I think we always like to ask about your shopping experience. So what do you got?
Yeah, so the other day I bought an Australian printing of a book called Killers at Sea by someone named Alan Joseph. Here, I'm holding up a copy for you.
Oh, yeah.
It's a contemporary maritime adventure starring a restless and solitary action hero named Logan. Now, I had already a 1970 U.S. printing of a book called Logan by Alan Joseph.
I've seen that cover before.
You've seen that cover, Eric, because you reviewed a book called Wake Up Dead by William Wall that used the exact same cover art, but this one's called Logan. So I knew nothing about this series. Looks like this 2-book series. I didn't know if it was Australian or American or what it is. So I contacted a guy, he's a listener of ours who gets in touch with us, and he's sort of my go-to guy for all things Australian. His name's Graham. And so I sent him an email, and he solved it through some deep diving Google searches. Alan Joseph, the guy who wrote this, is a pseudonym for John Messman.
Really?
Yeah, the grandfather of the Trailsman series. He also wrote...
we just did Handyman, Jefferson Boone.
Right, and so these are 2 books starring his series character Logan. Killers at Sea is the first one. It was released in the U.S. by Belmont in 1970. Set in South Carolina, Logan finds a dead man on the beach, leading to danger, diamonds, and death. And the second one was released a few months later, and it was actually called Logan, and it set aboard his boat, the Sea Urchin. I haven't read them, but I wonder if it's kind of a more adventurous and hard-boiled version of Travis McGee books. That's sort of my instinct on them. I think Graham thought so as well. But I love Messman, and I'm thrilled to own this 2-book series. So I'm going to give those a shot sometime, and then hopefully this year, and look for those reviews at paperbackwarrior.com.
Yeah, and this year we really should do a feature on John Messman. He deserves it.
Yeah, I need to do some homework. I know nothing about the guy or his life, and so I always like to kind of throw in those details to add a little context as to who he was. But he was a real prolific guy, and everything he touched turned to gold as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Yeah, it's to prepare us for that feature. If you have any information on John Messman, send it our way.
Yeah, we're looking for informants who can tell us about John Messman.
Right.
If John Messman's kids are listening, hit me up. I want to hear about Daddy.
There you go. All right, so that wraps us up. We're all done.
That's it. So listen, thank you for joining us. Please join us on our website at paperbackwarrior.com, and we'll be back next Monday at 6 a.m. Thank you so much for listening, and keep us in mind when you're picking out great podcasts and recommending them to friends and family. Bye-bye now.